Another thing we know about our wages in Illinois is the wage gap between whites and minorities is getting worse, not better. Now, why would that be? Well, once I'm going to be very clear about this, it's very clear from the data, there's still racism in labor markets. We're all here to talk about fun stuff like the state of Illinois' budget. And it's entertaining if you enjoy Stephen King and writers along those lines. So I'm going to jump right into it, telling you the starting point for our work. My organization is not nonpartisan, we are bipartisan. So what that means is my board of directors literally mistrusts and dislikes each other. And that is a good thing, because we don't allow their ideological viewpoint to impact staff's work. We look at best practices, we look at the data, and we make recommendations predicated on best practices and data. And if it's too conservative for someone or too liberal for someone, that's too bad. You got to do the right thing, whatever is dictated by the data and best practices. So it's a very interesting group. Where we were in January before the tax increase passed, the state of Illinois was confronting about a $16 billion revenue shortfall for the coming fiscal year 2012, which started on June 1st of 2011. How we got there? Well, here's what we anticipated in revenue. You can see up here it's about $26 billion. That's what we knew was coming in. Here were our hard costs coming into 2012, things that we knew we had to pay. Top line, kind of a scary one, $6 billion in unpaid bills that would have been left over from 2011, $6 billion. That was one of the hard costs we knew we had. We had to replace $3 billion in one-time revenue, mostly from the ARA that we used the prior year. We had $2 billion in debt service. We had a $4 billion pension payment. We had $2 billion we'd owed out in transfers to local governments and road funds and things like that. So net, 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 we knew we had $18 billion of hard costs. Hard costs. Can't mess with it. The prior year, FY 2011, we spent $24 billion in our general fund budget. Well, these hard costs are also paid out of the general fund budget. And there's the general fund revenue. We had $26 billion in revenue coming in, and just to maintain 2011 service levels in 2012, we had $42 billion in revenue needs. Now, because these are hard costs and can't be cut, that full $16 billion shortfall was in this $24 billion general fund. That's how the math worked. Now, that's not exactly the best position to be in, especially when you consider what the general fund pays for. 9 out of $10 historically at the state of Illinois level goes to just 4 things: education, health care, human services, public safety. So when politicians say things like, well, I'm going to solve our problems with across-the-board cuts, this would be the board. And if you look at it, the biggest part of the board is education. So if you've got a huge budget deficit, you cannot solve that without cutting education. Just not possible mathematically. Now that's why, once again, when politicians talk about these things, they never get very specific about what they'd cut. They'd say things like, oh, I don't know, let's eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse. And really, I've not seen the candidate who's run on the waste, fraud, and abuse platform that they are for more. And this being Illinois, you'd imagine we should have a line item for waste, fraud, and abuse, just so we could tell you all what it would be. Sadly, we're not that transparent. But the good news is there's not that much waste, fraud, and abuse in the state budget. I mean, the truth is we're a pretty lean and mean state. Do I think politicians manage to spend some money unwisely nonetheless? Do I think they manage to give contracts to cronies that are undeserving and do not provide this? Yes, of course. Of course they do all that stuff. But the reality is it's not material. And it certainly isn't the driver of our fiscal problems. And spending isn't the driver of our fiscal problems. If you read the newspapers, you would think that, in fact, we have this crazy, out-of-control, profligate spending state, right? Well, reality is very different. This blue bar shows you the percentage increase over this time period from 2000 to 2010 in nominal dollars in our general fund budget on those services. Nominal dollars means it hasn't been adjusted for inflation, population. So yeah, were we spending more in just plain old dollars in 2010 than we were spending in the year 2000 if you just looked at the dollar totals? Of course we were. We thought maybe we'd have a little more realistic approach by adjusting for inflation and population growth. So the first bar says, right after you adjust for just inflation using the consumer price index and population growth, in 2010 we were actually spending 5% less than in the year 2000 on those four core services, 5% less. Now, the consumer price index is a really good inflation metric for the economy as a whole, but not so much for government spending. Here's why. Because it is a metric that covers the economy as a whole, it includes things like Pop-Tarts and Clorox bleach and hair care products. State government doesn't buy a lot of Pop-Tarts or Clorox bleach, or, well, at least since Blagojevich has been gone, hair care products. What state government buys is, in fact, labor. Every public service, think about education, health, human services, and public safety, are very labor intensive. The whole cost of human services is pretty much the cost of the social workers. Education is the teachers and et cetera. So there is an inflation metric tied to the cost of purchasing labor over time. It's the employment cost index. Adjusting for inflation using the employment cost index, we were actually spending close to 18% less in the year 2010 than we had a decade earlier on those four core services. So Illinois was not ramping up its expenditures on services, anything but. The reality is it was spending less. We looked at the 2011 budget and went all the way back to 1995, which is the last year that we could get complete data spending for. And after inflation, using the CPI, because they only started publishing the employment cost index in 2000, so we didn't have an ECI previously. Using just the CPI, we were spending 5% less in 2011 on those four core services than Governor Edgar did in 1995. So I should give you some perspective. Edgar was a lot of things, but spendthrift not counted among them. All right, and I just thought I'd give you a breakdown by every major service category. So you look at the general fund, you take out that pension ramp payment, and we'll get to that in a second. And you can see the general fund expenditures overall were down by $6 billion after inflation. K through 12 education down by $592 billion. This is just over a decade. Higher ed really killed, cut 36%, down $1.2 billion in real terms. Healthcare, despite the ramp up in Medicaid and Medicaid eligibility, we're spending less. Okay. Human services, and I'll explain why politically human services always bears the brunt of the budget cuts, way down, 31%, $2.2 billion. The year-to-year cuts even worse, and public safety down. All right, why do public officials always cut human services first? Well, what they spend their money on are what? Education, health, human services, and public safety. Who here has a kid? Anybody have a kid? Who here has ever been a kid? Anybody ever? You have. Education has something close to universal political appeal. Whether or not you have a kid, you were a kid, you went through the system, voters get it. Healthcare. Anybody here ever have to see a doctor? Ever? In your life? Public safety. You like coming home to a safe environment, a street that's not overrun with drugs and crime and gangs? Of course. Human services. Who here actually has a developmentally disabled adult living with them in their immediate family? No one. Politicians get that. So because human services care for the most vulnerable members of our society, but the problems that these vulnerable members of society have are not universally known experientially by their constituents, they cut it. It's easier politically. So to be very clear what human services is, Over half of it, 54% of all human services expenditures are two things: mental health and developmental disabilities. You get up to 3/4 of human services expenditures when you throw in the Department on Aging, caring for seniors. And the final part, the final 25% of human services, are things like abused and neglected children, substance abuse, domestic violence treatment and prevention, teen pregnancy services, those things. So net, none of those are universal among constituents. So that's the very first line to get cut in the budget every year, and we've produced the data that demonstrates that's precisely what they've done. So no, it wasn't out of control, runaway, profligate spending that caused these deficit problems. It was primarily caused by the number one thing there on the board, which is flawed tax policy. And that flawed tax policy was so bad, is so bad still in Illinois, that it encouraged elected officials to engage in highly irresponsible fiscal practices. So you combine bad tax policy with irresponsible fiscal practices, you get a big deficit, and then of course something called the Great Recession comes along and sucker punches you right when you're down. Tax policy ought to be four things in a capitalist economy. Four very simple things: fair, responsive, stable, and efficient. Those are the things any fiscal policy expert would look for a tax system to work in a modern economy. Unfortunately, they'd have to physically leave Illinois to find any of them. Illinois is 0 for 4. So if you're 0 for 4 on the things you need to have a tax system that'll work, you get this. Who's heard of a structural deficit? Do you know what it really is? I'm going to explain it in simple terms. In simple terms, it just means if you adjust for two things, inflation and population growth, and you maintain your spending constant, so you don't add a program, you don't expand a program, you don't increase a program, you just fund tomorrow the level of services you're funding today. After you adjust for inflation and population growth, your cost line will grow like this, but your revenue line will grow like that. Literally built into the very structure of how you tax, there's a deficit because your mix of revenues in a modern economy won't grow at sufficient levels to maintain your services. Very simple concept. This is the actual structural deficit in Illinois over the last decade. Once again, we just adjusted for population growth and inflation growth, took all of our revenue streams and all of our spending on those core services. And we also took out the Great Recession. We pretended there was normal economic growth over that decade. Even with normal economic growth, what you see is year to year, revenue is far below. The zero line is the top line. That's why every bar is red. Revenue growth is far below what it costs to maintain the expenditure levels the state had. That's a structural deficit. Now that lack of enough revenue every year to maintain spending on those four core services encourages this, which is the irresponsible fiscal practice, the key one, underfunding pensions. In fact, for decades, the way state government papered over the fact that it had this ongoing structural deficit was to not make its pension contribution, its employer pension contribution, to the 5 systems it has responsibility for. These are the 5 systems: the teacher's retirement system, the state employee retirement system, the state university, the judicial, and the General Assembly. So they basically were looking at the options this way. Well, to maintain services, we could increase taxes. Nope. Voters don't like taxes. Let's not talk about doing that. Well, we could cut spending. Well, spending's on those 4 core services. So other than human services, they weren't really willing to cut much spending. Well, how about we look at this long-term obligation to fund our pensions? Let's just not do that, because no one will notice. It's a long-term obligation, and in the long term, we're all dead. And by dead in political terms, you're out of office. So net, they push this obligation way out into the future. And it's resulted in a total unfunded liability today in the state of Illinois of $85.5 billion. Because, of course, after they underfunded the pensions for years, we had the markets collapse in 2008.